Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Norwich Talk for the first episode of our mini-series entitled The Review. Now, you might notice a little difference to last year's in the fact that one, Norwich City have been relegated, and two, it is a different ginger in glasses presenting. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Connor Southwell. Connor, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thank you. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm feeling good after that little intro. And also Mr. Dave Freezer. Dave, how you doing as well?
Yeah, good. It's been a long while since I've spoken to Connor on a Zoom chat.
Couple of hours, if that.
We should do
Is
this
that
more.
just what your days consist of now then?
I hate to think how many hours we spent talking to each other via video calls in the last, whatever it is, 5 months, but it's a lot.
Oh, I assume it's only going to get worse for you guys as well, isn't it? Right. Okay. So in today's video, we are going to talk about the beginning of Norwich City's season. And before this video, I was sort of thinking, what is the most depressing point of Norwich City's season? It's hard to sort of come up with an answer, really, isn't it? Because I was looking at the December period. That's a barrel last, isn't it? And I was looking at this period as well. And equally, it was just as fun to look at. Now, we're going to start with the transfer window, the infamous summer transfer window that I don't think went down or has gone down brilliantly. At the time, it seemed sort of decent. We were fairly optimistic going into the season. Connor, obviously, you hadn't entered your role yet. We'll get onto that a little bit later when we talk about that infamous win against Manchester City. But guys, I just want to know your thoughts. Cast your mind back nearly a year ago, as you said off camera, Dave, to the summer transfer window. What were we thinking, Dave? I'll turn to you first for that. But what were you thinking post transfer window?
Well, I remember the excitement there was about Amadou for a start, with everyone tracking his flight. I suppose I try to be a little bit cautious with transfers because, as you see from the Pinkham website, the interest in transfers nowadays is massive. And I think the football generation have really sort of taken hold of football to a certain extent, and just somebody arriving seems to immediately bring a bounce. We're seeing it at the moment, aren't we? The club are trying to change the narrative a little bit by turning people's attention to the future. And I tried to be a bit more cautious, like when the summer before, when we first saw Pukki, first few pre-seasons had no expectation of him becoming a 29 goal striker that season in the Championship. And there's been plenty of players who have started slowly. So I think there's always a degree of optimism, but sort of patience needed. But with the loanees, they looked decent. Fairman was always going to be good competition for Krul. Roberts, came with a good reputation. Dermich was always one who, it's easy in hindsight, but there's now just a few too many players in that Norwich squad who have got injury problems on their record, and he was always a bit of a risk. But probably the one that flew under the radar the most was Sam Byram, who that didn't create too much fuss. I remember him arriving when we were still out in Germany, and he probably ended up being the best one. So I think it's difficult to get a read on transfers when they initially happen, but experience has taught me just to hold off on making sort of snap judgments when people arrive.
You mentioned an interesting word there, which is expectations. Did your expectations rise after the signings came in at all? Or was it very much, as you said, just being patient and sort of seeing what happens?
Not really. No, I wouldn't have said I saw the transfer business and thought, right, that's it, Norwich are going to be fine this season. I think the crux of the matter was always that I think I was probably in that camp going into the season, that they had a squad that was good enough to stay up already, because they've been promoted in such style and they were such a tight-knit unit. The fans were so on board with it. The players were completely part of Farke's style. And if they hadn't been so disrupted, as I'm sure we'll come on to, particularly in defence, it's possible that they may well have still had enough to do it. But the chances were still pretty slim. But no, the transfer work didn't particularly move on my hopes that much, because they had really pinned their hopes on the nucleus of the squad that was already there, hadn't they, with all the contracts.
I think I'd be inclined to agree with you there, to be honest with you. I think me and Connor, we did a few podcasts before the season. I know when Patrick Roberts joined, and it was very much like there's a little bit of reputation, but we know at the same time for players to flourish at Norwich, you have to be patient. And it's such a key thing being a Norwich fan now. Connor, how are you feeling? I'll say post Liverpool, because that was a really weird game, wasn't it? We'd seen the transfers and the players come in, and then we got sort of just pushed aside by Liverpool with ease. But there was still that sort of feeling of optimism, wasn't there?
Yeah, in a weird sort of way, I kind of felt more optimistic leaving Anfield than I did when I went in, purely because of the way they performed in the second half. I think the first half was always going to be incredibly difficult, and I think with hindsight, it was probably a case that Liverpool took their foot off the accelerator a little bit rather than Norwich City sort of stepped up their levels. But I was kind of I was actually in the away end that night at Anfield, and I think it was Van Dijk said I sort of turned to my sister who I went with, and so they've not actually been too bad, and yet they find themselves 3-0 down. And little did I know that would be sort of a taste of the Premier League, that difference in quality and those small moments are so pivotal. But yeah, I kind of felt that was a shared feeling actually in the away sort of away end that day actually, that there was quite a bit of optimism regardless of the result, because ultimately, at that point, the achievement was that Norwich City were in the Premier League. This was a side 2 years ago who were sort of languishing in mid-table in the Championship. So there was a surrealness to it, as there always is with the Premier League. And of course, there's the theatre of it all. I think only the Premier League brings, in terms of, and Anfield for one, but opening night, first game of the Premier League season. So there was certainly a lot of hope. But interestingly, that night, I think Norwich City played 11 players who had all played in the Championship, hadn't they? So that was kind of a glimpse into perhaps their strategy last summer, which was really securing the talent that they already had at the club, rather than sort of investing in the same way Sheffield United did, or Villa, which is sort of beyond the realms of their limits. But that was kind of it, and it kind of felt like they had that buy-in, and I guess winning the league obviously helps that. But I didn't feel too deflated, I guess, after that Liverpool result, because, as I said, it kind of felt that there was moments within the game where they showed themselves quite well, where they tried to play their style of play, and okay, they got sort of brandished as naive, but it kind of felt, I'd probably counter that argument and say it was quite brave. Would it have won them the game at Anfield? No, probably not. But then I think if they'd have gone there and shut up shop, that they wouldn't have won the game either. So it's incredibly difficult. But yeah, I think that was probably a glimpse into what was to come in terms of the quality and how much you need to put into a Premier League game to win it. But I wasn't feeling overly pessimistic. I think probably cautious. The Premier League is a incredibly difficult division. It's a tremendously big step up from the Championship to the Premier League. But I think everyone really kind of felt that they had enough to go with, regardless of the new signings. And I'm sure we'll come on to Newcastle, but that performance almost sort of reiterated that fact that they had enough quality and they had enough strength in depth to have a real good go at the division.
Can you sum it up in a word, the post-Liverpool feeling? Because I remember being, feeling the same thing you just described, which was weirdly optimistic following a bit of a spanking from Liverpool. As you said, we're 3-0 down inside, 20, 25 minutes. And usually you're a bit like, right, oh God. Whereas the feeling was very much like, we're playing quite bravely, which was sort of admirable. And, we have the luxury of hindsight, which tells us this Liverpool team were going to go on to win the league very comfortably, playing some really good football. But can you sum it up in a word to put you on the spot?
No, I think optimism is the one I'll go for. But again, with hindsight, it seems odd now, because we talk about that approach, but ultimately it was that approach that got them relegated. And equally, if I think about the last game that we saw against Manchester City and their approach, and the first game against Liverpool and their approach, they were two completely different ways of approaching games against really world-class opponents, essentially. And I think it probably shows actually that, one, the hard knocks they got throughout the season and how it affected their confidence, and secondly, perhaps how Daniel Farke has responded as a coach to the challenges this season. But again, that's probably part of a wider debate. But yeah, I certainly felt optimism. I remember going to Norwich games under Chris Hughton away from home and being quite uninspired by the performances, and whether it was West Brom or Manchester United, they were kind of I don't know, sort of a submissive approach to the game, where they just kind of looked like they were hanging on for dear life. So there was a refreshing nature, I think, to the way they approached the Anfield game. But with hindsight, it was, I'd probably agree now with the naive comments that were bandied about at the time, to be fair, because I think it probably was a very naive way to approach an opening Premier League game against the European champions.
It's hard to disagree. It's certainly a new feeling at the time. Dave, how do you reflect on the Newcastle game now? Because Connor mentioned it, and at the time it felt like a massive win, and Norwich played Newcastle off the park, to my memory at least. But before we sort of generalise that period and move on to the injury crisis, how do you look back at that Newcastle game? Was it as important as we might have thought? Was it a chance for Norwich City to kick on?
I remember Newcastle were terrible. They just brought in Steve Bruce, hadn't they? And Mo Leitner absolutely dictated that game. That he looked like he was making that transition that we were all hoping that he would be able to, because he is capable of being a top level footballer, isn't he? Pukki he had all that confidence flowing through him clearly with the hat trick, which was the first one since Efan Ekuku in '94, I think it was, maybe '93. Since those 4 goals at Everton, and yeah, they absolutely bossed it. But I think Newcastle were just getting used to Steve Bruce, weren't they? And he was trying to make them more solid, and that they really did look quite poor that day. But my main memory of it is talking to Grant Hanley after the game, and he made that mistake for their late goal, and that should have been a clean sheet, shouldn't it? And he just got his sort of legs in a muddle, and Grant's got quite a dry sense of humour, shall we say. And when I'd already brought up the Liverpool own goal, I sort of said, I've got to ask you about it, sorry. And then I mentioned that, and he was like, are you winding me up?
Well, really? What, like angrily?
Well, I think everything Grant says comes across as angry at first, but then the smile soon sort of cracked because they'd won. So I think he's sort of intimidating at first, Grant Hanley, but once you sort of get to know him a bit, you understand where the humour's coming from. But he and Godfrey really were a lot better that day than they had been at Anfield, were a lot more aggressive, and it was probably the style of game which suited them a bit better. And they were really unfortunate not to get the clean sheet that day. But of course, we soon found out that Hanley was basically playing through the pain. And I think at that stage of this season, you could see that he wasn't quite right. He wasn't moving as freely as he needed to, and was a bit slow at times. And compare how he was playing once he was back from his injury before the lockdown to that, and it was quite a significant difference. But a totally deserved win, and it was something to build on. All that sort of buccaneering spirit from the Championship was alive and well.
First of all, fair play for not fainting when Grant Hanley says that, because what was he, 6'4"? He's absolutely terrifying. So fair play for staying on your 2 feet for that.
Well, he said a few things like that.
Did he? I don't know what I'd do.
I am 5 or 6 years older than him, so I have to sort of remind myself that sometimes, even when he's towering over me.
Even if I was older than him, I think I'd still end up telling my mum if he started picking on me, to be honest. He's that sort of guy, isn't he?
That is something I'd absolutely love to see. Right, chaps, I think we should move on to the bane of Norwich City season, which is injuries. Now, this is something that is very interesting, and on my notes here, it tells me via your video, Connor, that you kindly sent me in October, there was 11 injuries at the peak of it, and the peak of it came against Manchester City. Now, Connor, that was your first game. So first and foremost, what was that like for you in terms of your new role at the time?
Bizarre in terms of the first game. It was I kind of rocked up expecting to be reporting on a heavy defeat, and that was sort of. I think during the week I was sort of speaking to Pad and sort of said I remember turning to Dave and Paddy before kickoff and said if this is 5 or under, then Norwich would have done well. So that sort of sums up how I was feeling at the time. But I was in that press conference the day before where Daniel Farke literally just listed the injuries, and I was kind of sat there, and it was like I don't know, this defender out, and you think, well, that's okay because so and so can come in to replace them. Oh, they're injured as well. So and it was a bit like that, and that's kind of the way it transpired. And by the end, it was really difficult to plot how they were going to field a team of 11 players in their natural positions, let alone a side capable of going and sort of delivering a knockout blow to the champions. So it was it was ridiculous, really. It was a really strange first game to have, a real surreal first game. But I guess from my perspective, it's one that I certainly won't forget. I didn't get like a 0-0 against Burnley or something, which would have been perhaps less memorable. But it was a really strange game. I've never seen Carrow Road like that in terms of an atmosphere. And I was at the playoff semi-final against Ipswich, and I can't remember a tackle being met with a standing ovation by the City stand, for example. It was immense. And people talk about, and I think we've seen subsequently sort of the impact of supporters, obviously with what's going on at the moment. But that day they really did drag them over the line, and it kind of, there was sort of an invincibility about Norwich that day. It kind of felt like whatever they got through at them, they would respond to. And I mean, we touched on Ibrahim Amadou. He was absolutely massive that day. He was a colossus in the back line, and I think that we saw that level of performance from him at centre back, which probably increased the excitement to sort of answer your question from earlier on. And then obviously the performance against Arsenal, which again inflated it, and then it obviously subsequently didn't work out. But it was just a really strange day. Still gutted I missed Kenny McLean's header in the flesh. I have my head in my laptop, sadly, which was probably a lesson learned, I think. But no, it was a really good day, I think, for personally and for like a spectacle to report on that. I don't think I could have sort of written a better opening game to have than that, to be honest. Although we were brought down to earth for a bump next week when we had to go to Turf Moor, and they got beaten up by Burnley. Essentially, that was sort of like, right, here we go. But no, it was really good fun, and I think that day sort of confirmed to me why I sort of wanted to do this job, essentially. And we haven't seen much of it this year, but it's days like that where you appreciate sort of being there, and I mean, to get to do what we do is a privilege anyway. But when it's days like that and results like that, I think it makes it that bit more special. But yeah, it's certainly a first game that I won't be forgetting anytime soon, I don't think.
Would you call it a baptism of fire, but one that you enjoyed?
Yeah, definitely. It was. It kind of felt like it was. Everything was 100 miles an hour. Of course, I was still trying to get to. It was my first game, so I was still trying to get to grips with what I was supposed to be doing. And, and sort of in the background, you've got Norwich pulling off one of their greatest wins in Premier League history, arguably. So it was. Yeah, it really was a baptism of fire. But we got through it, and it was all good in the end. So that's the main thing. Ultimately, it was about the result for Norwich, wasn't it? Because it was such a special day and such a really good narrative as well. Actually, it was almost David beat Goliath. But I mean, I spoke about this earlier on the Pinkham podcast. Actually, that second goal almost sort of validated why they were doing what they were doing. They I think it started from a throw in, and then they broke the Manchester City press, and it was essentially. It was Buendia and Steepman created that, didn't they? And then set Pukki away, he squares it to Cantwell. It was a brilliant goal, and it was them playing their way against Manchester City and doing it successfully. And I think that's probably where the optimism came from that game. It wasn't a fluky. If it was 1-0 and it was Kenny McLean's header, I think maybe the script is a little bit different. But to do it in the way they did it, I think made it a bit more special for everyone. And yeah, that Carrow Road atmosphere was immense. The response to the final whistle, I've never seen anything like that, and I'm not sure we will for a very long time.
I remember the Cantwell goal. I thought Pukki had shot, genuinely. And I just see Todd Cantwell come out of nowhere and knock the ball in. I don't know if you've seen the picture, Dev. I know you have, Connor, of that picture of me and Cantwell walking past, just looking at that, thinking, what on earth is going on? But, you know, it's nice to sort of reminisce, isn't it? But if we cast our minds back 10 months, well, I say, we look at it now. Do you think it was a fluke, Dave? Do you think it was just a footballing miracle?
Ooh. Yeah, I think it has taken on. I wrote this in my column actually last week that a few days after that game, Stuart Webber signed his new contract and went down to speak to him at Colney. And he had sort of criticised the national media reaction to it, like it being a complete shock, and saying, well, you know, we are a Premier League side. I think the example he used was it's not Wigan beating them in the FA Cup as they had done a couple of seasons before in as a League One team. And with hindsight, it has become like a cup upset, hasn't it? If you look at the statistics, they had way more shots, way more corners, dominated possession. They had an off day. They you know, you look at the amount of chances they had that they just tamely put towards Krul at the end, or you know, they were thwarted by some brilliant defending. It was one of those days where everything has to come together, like it does for a big shot like that. And it is still a big shot. You know, Manchester City are owned by multi-billionaires, almost infinitely wealthy people, and the amount of money they've spent is just eye-watering compared to Norwich. Like, it just, you can't even slightly compare it to a club like Norwich City. They've got basically the best coach in the world and Pep Guardiola in charge. They've got an absolute galaxy of stars to choose from. And Norwich had all those injuries. I think it was 9 on the day against Manchester City, wasn't it? With 2 or 3 more playing through the pain, like Tete and stuff. So I think it's one of those where, maybe not a miracle, but the situation meant that they dug that little bit deeper. They got that extra 5% out of themselves, like Amadou playing at centre-back, who really put absolutely everything on the line. They didn't worry about Burnley to come in 7 days. They just chucked everything they had at it to try and pull off an upset, and they did. And then, you've got Zimmerman coming on his crutches onto the pitch at full time to hug Amadou because he appreciated that guy had really gone to the well for the team that day. And, he didn't even speak particularly good English. And at that point, we're still getting to know his teammates and had really tried hard. Sam Byram as well. He was up against Raheem Sterling in his first appearance of the season pretty much. And he was inspired. They gave absolutely everything. And emptying the tank to that extent did mean that left them vulnerable. We could all see it coming at Turf Moor, couldn't we? We could see that it was going to be after the Lord Mayor's show. Everyone was saying it, that Burnley, it was just going to be such a different type of challenge that you could see the defeat coming. But the thing with Man City is they are sort of, I remember when Daniel Farke arrived, sort of asking Eddie Reamer, his assistant. There was a media day at Carrow Road when, Farke sat next to Webber and spoke to the media, and then we got to speak to some of the coaches. And I asked Eddie Reamer what Farke was like, and he said that he was from the Guardiola school of thinking, really. So, and we probably saw that on Sunday as well, with the way they were chatting to each other in the technical areas during the game, that they think about football in the same way. So the styles there, it was a brilliant game of football to watch, wasn't it? Because it's 2 attacking teams. Then you come up against Burnley and they're the total antithesis of Norwich. So, yeah, but you've got to hold on to those special memories because that's what it's all about. The Roar at full time was pretty much the best I've ever heard at Carrow Road. The only, Ipswich in the playoffs would be pretty close. And the 2-0 win over Man United in 2005 is one that I always get back to as being a really special night as well. But yeah, unfortunately, as it's proved now, Norwich probably were still a Championship team playing in the Premier League, and it has taken on that little bit of a cup upset vibe, I think.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? And I think it will get more fascinating as time goes on when you sort of reflect on that game, because this is a Man City who were following their second, is it consecutive Premier League win? And they just got 100 points. And this is a ridiculous achievement for any team. And Pep Guardiola was just dominating the Premier League. And then little old Norwich just beat them. And, the football, as you mentioned, it was really good to watch. It was towards the end sort of backs up against the wall, but it was really good from Norwich, wasn't it? Now, I'm going to turn to you first for this question, Connor. I've got a question for you both, which is, this is a pretty big question, but is, from a Norwich City perspective, is the high from that game worth the low of relegation?
No,
or nights like that, from a fan's perspective?
No, I don't think so. I think if you'd have offered Norwich fans a 5-0 defeat, but they stay in the Premier League, I think most supporters would have taken that. What I would say about that, and to answer your question, I think it's one of those nights that people will always have. That it's the I was there element, wasn't it? And that's going to be the thing that lives on, I think. And probably when people reflect on, maybe not this season, but when they reflect on certain Norwich City games, then that's right up there. But I think if you'd have offered Norwich fans a 14th place finish for a 5-0 Manchester City defeat in that game, then everyone would have taken it, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, you're right that it is special. But equally, what Sheffield United did is incredibly special, and their supporters remember that. So I think it's one of those one-off events like Manchester United in 2005 that I think people will go back to and remember fondly, and it will sort of be timeless now, I think, in terms of the way it's remembered. It's there in Norwich City history. Everyone can view it, but you've got to put it in the context of the rest of the season, which was it was a one-off. They never replicated it. They never replicated that level of performance, and that for me is the shame, because that day I think they showed, forget Norfolk and forget the country, they showed the world what they could do on the Premier League stage, and it's a shame that they couldn't follow up on that to some extent. And so I think definitely in terms of a one-off game, it's certainly up there. In terms of is it worth relegation? I think definitely not. In terms of financially, in terms of everyone wants to be watching Norwich City compete in the at the top level and against these top sides. So that's my view on it. I don't really see a situation where people would say that they would accept relegation because of that game. In my view, as special as it is, I think staying in the Premier League under Daniel Farke, playing the way that they came up with, would have been probably more special and more memorable than a one-off game against Manchester City, in my view.
Dave, you answer the same?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I've got to agree with Connor really, because I think if you'd have offered every Norwich fan at the start of that day survival or win over Man City, they'd have taken survival, even though that's slightly boring, and I would hate to lose those memories now that they exist. If Norwich would have stayed up this season, they would have been in an incredible position. As a self-funded club, they would then be in a position where they could bank basically a lot of that cash. That would have set them up for the potential to become established in the Premier League. But unfortunately, people that follow Norwich know this isn't the first time they've missed the boat, is it? Even back in the 90s, they missed out on the big injection of cash when they went down in, was it 20? I suppose it was under Neil, was it? Or it might have been under Houghton, when the first mega sort of billion pound deal for the broadcasting rights came in. Norwich have kept missing that chance to become the established side, didn't they, in the Premier League? So yeah, just if you look at the overall status of the club, survival would have had to have been taken over anything, even if it came in a Houghton style of it being ground out with draws. I think this season that's what they needed really, and they lacked. They had the style and not the substance at the wrong time almost.
Okay, fellas, we'll move on to injuries. I think it'll probably be suitable to blend the analysis of post-Man City, so Burnley, Palace, and Villa as well, into sort of the injury crisis debate. I don't know what you want to call it. But Dave, I'll turn to you on a broader point. What went on? Like, is that something that you blame on Norwich's relegation? Is that one of the main sort of pertinent reasons Norwich went down?
The injuries.
The injuries, yeah. Yeah,
defensively, that really did pull the rug out from under them, didn't it? To lose Closer, Zimmerman and Hanley all in such a short space of time, before you even get into Vrancic and Hernandez early doors and the little bits and pieces in around it, to lose your three senior centre-backs in a squad which aren't exactly renowned for their defensive ability anyway, that was really cruel. And Ben Godfrey had a lot of pressure on his shoulders this season. That's a big caveat whenever you talk about his form, really, because he has been up and down, as have all of Norwich's young players, but he had a serious amount of pressure on him. He was injured as well
played through a hernia.
Yeah,
just after or something like that.
And he did his knee in December as well, didn't he? When Hanley and Zimmerman were back. So defensively, it's just ridiculous. And, the Zimmerman one, to be done by that horrible tackle by Haller at West Ham, which didn't even get booked. Closer was an impact one in that nightmare night at Crawley. So they were unfortunate. Hanley was trying to be the captain and the leader, wasn't he? And playing through the pain. And as I said a little earlier, you could see in pre-season in the early doors that he wasn't right, and he eventually, he was on the bench against Man City just as emergency cover, wasn't he? He eventually needed double surgery to get himself back, and thankfully that had worked. So I think if those three had not got injured, I really don't think they would have got into quite as bad a situation as they did, and certainly coming back from lockdown wouldn't have had quite so much of a mountain to climb. And who knows, that December period, they might have just turned a couple of those draws into wins if the defenders had been in a better run of things. So yeah, it sounds it sounds like too much like an excuse to keep talking about the injuries, doesn't it? And particularly if you're outside of the club, people will be like, well, everyone has injuries. But to have your 3 senior centre-backs wiped out early in the season was very, very difficult to recover from.
In terms of the post-Man City form, Connor, do you just put the sort of heavy defeat, or I say the heavy defeat and the 2 sort of pain in the backside defeats, which were Burnley and Palace, do you put that down to injuries or just sort of coming down from the high of Man City? Is it as easy as that?
Yeah, partially. I think, as Dave mentioned, the defensive injuries were terminal really this season. I don't think they ever really recovered from those. It was so bad at one point. I feared I was going to get a game, and I mean, you've seen me play football. That wouldn't have been a
Then you're in a
thing.
Cambridge shirt. We know you can.
Well, I don't want to remind you, but when I was 11, I was on their books, so it was their loss, not mine, as far as I'm concerned.
Clearly a teammate of Wes Newham, basically.
Well, exactly. Wes has followed in some fine
don't
footsteps.
say that, Dave. Oh, come on.
But no, those away games that you mentioned, Palace, Burnley, I think Brighton was around that period as well, wasn't it? They kind of felt very similar, 2-0 defeats. Norwich weren't really in the games particularly. It kind of felt like their opponents had them at arm's length. And yeah, I think a lot of that was probably injury based. I think a lot of it was the beginning of their confidence beginning to sap away a little bit. And a lot of it was sort of square pegs in round holes. I mean, that Palace game you mentioned, we saw obviously Ralph Fearman start the game, didn't we? And got replaced after 20 minutes after
Wasn't he already injured?
Yeah, he was. I think he was, and I kind of, I don't know if it was. I think it was probably Pad I turned to when the teams came out, and he kind of looked like he had. Maybe it was just me reading too much into it, but he kind of looked like he had a little bit of a limp then. So, but look, I don't blame the guy because ultimately it was an opportunity to play, wasn't it? And he was so desperate to impress. I think for all that's been said and written about Ralph Fearman, I think that he did generally want it to work. So that was unfortunate. So then Norwich had to adapt to playing to Michael McGovern, and as much as McGovern is an excellent shot stopper, I think there's clearly deficiencies there in terms of his technical ability. And you could see, particularly at Palace, I felt with Ben Godfrey, there was a moment in the second half or first half when he wanted to play the ball back to Michael McGovern and sort of hesitated in the end. And they were kind of losing possession of that a little bit. So I think there are a lot of factors. The fact they didn't have Tim Krul as well, who's such a massive protagonist for how he organises that back four. That didn't help defensively, I don't think. So for me, this was probably the period where their confidence got knocked, and I don't think they ever fully recovered from that. But yeah, I think injuries play a massive part, and ultimately, I don't think you can talk about this season and Norwich City's performance without mentioning injuries, because they have whether or not you agree or disagree that luck came into it, there is an element of misfortune of how many they had injured at one time. And the way Daniel Farke wants to train, his training is so intense. They go very, very close to the line, and there will be times where they overstep that and players get injured. But equally, the benefit of that is all the late goals we saw in the Championship. So there's pros and cons. Daniel Farke likes his players to be incredibly fit. I don't know, maybe it was the intensity of training and the intensity of Premier League games that were a factor. I'm not sure. But they certainly seem maybe to have learnt from that, I think, in the second half of the year, if they've adapted anything. But as Dave said, a few of those were contact injuries. So you have to feel for them in that regard, because they can't be helped. But yeah, I felt in terms of their confidence, in terms of their style, it all changed so quickly for them. And I don't think they ever fully recovered, sadly.
Dave, I want to cast your mind back to a place it probably doesn't want to go, which is post Aston Villa. The home game, that is, of course. How devastating was that for Norwich at the time? Now you can sort of look back upon it, because it was such a heavy defeat, and it was fairly, I think I got a bit of secondhand embarrassment watching it. But do you think that was sort of detrimental to Norwich City players' confidence as well as sort of the fans?
I mean, the scoreline, when you look back on it, yeah, it does look bad. And Villa just turned up that day, didn't they? They just turned it on, and Norwich were at a low ebb with the injuries. McGovern saved a penalty as well, didn't he? And
good double save.
Yeah, even though they lost 5-1. So I think that was kind of the culmination of the injuries, wasn't it? And they then went into an international break, and that's when Pukki went and qualified with Finland, wasn't it, in that international break? And they came back from that, and Godfrey had made this miraculous recovery from his hernia surgery in just a week. and they were able to go to Bournemouth and grind out a 0-0 draw with Tete in defence. And the Villa game was embarrassing, but I think they were so down to the bare bones that I don't think people took it to heart too much. You compare it to Palace. Palace, they were in the game. They, conceded the second quite late on. If all the sort of goalkeeper fuss hadn't happened in that game, they might have managed to nick something, because Palace play in quite a negative way, don't they? And they allowed Norwich to have a bit of the ball in that match, whereas Villa knew exactly what Norwich were all about from the season before, and they just went for the jugular, didn't they?
I remember after the game, especially, I sort of drew a comparison in my head to Newcastle with Alex Neil when we lost, 6-2? And I remember thinking, is Daniel Farke about to do this? Now, Dave, you know Daniel Farke better than anyone, really. Was there ever a point
to differ?
Well, was there ever a point where perhaps you thought he might crack or anything like that? Because it's hard not to after a result like that. It's hard for a manager not to probably go insane. But was there ever a point, especially after Aston Villa, where you thought maybe he might crack?
No, not really. I really went into this season thinking that there was pretty much nothing that could happen this season that would put Daniel Farke's role under threat, because he'd achieved such a major success the season before, and such a big turnaround of not just things on the pitch, but he was part of the Webolution, as so many people used to say, and Farke ball was the focus for it on the pitch. But fans had talked so often about feeling more part of the club, and all the flags, the groups that had played a big part in that. It had been such a genuine revolution of the club that I really did think he was untouchable this season. And I did actually use the analogy in the Six Things in today's paper that I thought that Farke and Webber were in so much credit that they were pretty much untouchable this season, but now they're almost in their overdrafts with Norwich fans, because a 10 successive league defeats, a club record, that has entered the realms where it is going to do damage to them. And if it was any other club in any other situation, a head coach does not survive that. That's quite clear. But I feel like Daniel has always known that they're going to give him the backing going forward, that he is part of the long-term plan, and that he's committed to that project. So not at that stage, certainly. In recent weeks, towards the end of the season, there has been thoughts: is this going to get to him? Is he going to fall on his own sword? Never was convinced that was going to happen. And then I think by the end, the last 2 or 3 games, it was just persevering with it, wasn't it? And getting to the end of the season, whatever happened, it was damage limitation. They didn't really manage to limit the damage, but they did manage to get to the finishing line, and then he can start again. But yeah, I never thought it would get this dark for Daniel.
Now, Connor, you mentioned this earlier. I feel like I should have asked this earlier. You mentioned the word naivety earlier. And I think there was that label put on Stuart Webber in terms of his idea going into this season by some pundits, by some fans as well, in terms of this idea that it was 38 free hits for Norwich. Looking back on it now, I think the important thing is to look on it now. How do you view that? Was it naive, or do you think he still sticks by it? Do you still stick by this idea that it was 38 free hits for Norwich?
I think it's good comms, isn't it? If you're a side tip to go down, then all he's doing is managing expectation. He's tempering it a little bit. I mean, he stood after promotion, didn't he? After that game at Blackburn, where everyone was on cloud 9, and some were talking about top 10 finishes. I don't think we were, Ben, to be honest. But
no, certainly not.
Some people were, and he said that they had to reclimb Everest, essentially, didn't he? So I think what you get with Stuart Webber and Daniel Farke, and some people don't like it, and that's fine, but is the brutal honesty. And I mean, I sit in Daniel Farke's press conferences every week, and I've never got the sense from him that what he says, and I know there's been lots of criticism of perhaps his demeanour and his rhetoric and what he says, and that is quite, I probably wouldn't use the word defeatist, but maybe it's negative, and that's how some people perceive it. But actually sitting in his press conferences this season, be it virtually or in person, I kind of feel that there's a reality and a realism to what he says, rather than perhaps a defeatist attitude. And um, again, he's had to endure a lot, I think, as Norwich's head coach, in terms of, I remember Alex Pritchard getting sold, and perhaps he wasn't best pleased about that, and he's had to see essentially his best players and his tools cut away from him, hasn't he? And said, there you go and produce a winning side on the pitch. So it's incredibly difficult. And I think Stuart Webber summed it up quite nicely, actually, last year, when he said we're essentially asking Daniel to produce a winning team on the pitch with a very, very young squad, and that's difficult to do because young squads are inconsistent. So I think there was an element of comms about it. I think there was an element of realism about it. And I think he's probably been proven right to an extent, that Norwich didn't have the quality, and that fundamentally, you can boil it down to whatever you want, injuries, luck, whatever, but fundamentally it's quality. They didn't have enough quality in enough moments. And the amount of games I've sort of sat through this year, and whether be it in this period or be it later on in the season, where they're in games, they're competing, and then a side will just slip it in a higher gear for 10, 20 minutes and they're 2-0 down and they've won the game, and you kind of think, what happened there? So yeah, I think 38 free hits, to an extent, I think he's been proven right on that. But I think it was probably realism rather than sort of buying himself time, because they're just one promotion, equaling Nigel Worthington's side and 94 points. They didn't need to buy time. This was realism, and this was probably telling Norwich City fans it wouldn't be easy. And as I said, I think they've been proven right on both of those accounts. But I think that Norwich fans will look at someone like Chris Wilder, who I remember I was sat in the Crystal Palace press room when they lost to Liverpool, and Dean Henderson made that horrendous error. I think it was 1-0. It was a very tight game. And his post-match interview after was essentially, it's not good enough. We need to compete against these sides. And he basically set the expectations. And we've seen that recently as well with the interview after Leicester as well. So different people have different approaches. But I think Daniel Farke put it quite aptly. When a team is so low on confidence, the last thing that you want to go and do is beat them up in the media every week. So I kind of get it, and I kind of get why they did it as well. But I think when they decided to be loyal to their squad, and so that they had to give them patience and they had to temper expectations. And I completely understand why he said what he said.
At what point for a manager does it become a little bit too much, this idea of having his tools taken away and given new ones sort of every season, so to speak? At what point does it then become just too much and a bit like a yo-yo, if you will, because that's the term we get labelled with?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it today. I've basically done a piece tomorrow sticking up for Daniel Farke a little bit. But I mean, it's difficult to ask someone to make a jigsaw if either they've got the wrong pieces or they're missing entirely. It's his job is as good as the recruitment is, essentially, and the recruitment wasn't very good. So you can talk about his tactical flaws and his errors, and there have been some, and I think he's held his hands up to those as well. But ultimately, if he doesn't have the quality, then there's not a lot you can do. I mean, I sat in on Stuart Webber's Canaries Trust thing last night, and I won't use the exact phrase, but it was essentially how do we turn chicken feces, I'll paraphrase, into chicken salad. So I think that sums it up quite nicely. I think as a head coach in the model that Norwich have, you're only as good as your recruitment, and the recruitment wasn't very good, and I don't think it's any surprise that Norwich City haven't been very good this season.
There's something admirable, isn't there, about Stuart Webber? And there's this idea that he came into Norwich being so transparent with the fans. And I think I'm totally with you in terms of this idea of 38 free hits. I wasn't too annoyed at it. I know there was a bit of an outcry. I think it's just sort of, he will tell you how it is. And sometimes you just don't like what he says, which is just the case. And it's nice to have that at Norwich, isn't it? The sort of openness, because we've not had it for a while, certainly not in my lifetime, at least. I think the closest we've had is Jez Moxey.
So, yeah, I was going to say, sorry to interrupt. I actually, I don't know what I was doing. I stumbled into the dark web. Obviously, I found that interview with Jez Moxey a few years ago where it was
What were you doing
question,
there?
answer, cut, and that kind of sort of brought it home to me, perhaps how open the new regime is at Norwich City. So, and you only have to see Mike Ashley and what's happening at Wigan. Some people don't even see their owners. So I think, or their board. So I think Norwich City are very fortunate that they've got people who do stand up and answer difficult questions, even if the answers sometimes aren't what supporters want to hear. And ultimately, that's why they get paid the money, isn't it?
I think for me, the thing that sums up Stuart Webber is the fact that on transfer deadline day of 2019, we were invited to go and interview. Or I say you were invited to go and interview him, and it's just like, who does that in the Premier League or the Championship at the time? But like in terms of professional football, who does that? It's such
The
a
day before
rarity.
Leeds United as well, wasn't it? Or a
It
couple
was,
of days
yeah.
before that Leeds United win. So yeah.
It really is admirable. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll finish up with post-international break form, because it was a very interesting period for Norwich. I think I'll describe it as we drew with Bournemouth. I remember I think it was on Terrace Talk, and we spoke about how Norwich did the best thing that they could do following not winning, which was keeping a clean sheet. And that was a game where Ben Godfrey, as we mentioned earlier, was playing post his hernia operation. Am I right in saying? Which is it's just ridiculous for someone of that age, of any age, to play through that injury. Now, in that spell, we'll finish on Everton. In that spell, we lost 3-1 to Manchester United, 2-0 to Brighton, 2-0 to Watford away, and then we beat Everton. We'll push Everton to the side, and we'll finish on a slightly more positive note in retrospect. But what do we make of that form? Because the 3-1 loss to Man United wasn't very good, was it? We I think we played good for 20 minutes, and then arguably you could say we did against Brighton, and Watford the whole game was poor. Was it just injuries? What was it for you? What was that spell for you, Connor?
Quality. Simple as that. Watford was a particularly depressing night. I mean, we were speaking about this on the podcast earlier. Buendia turns, gives the ball away within 3 minutes, and it was kind of like, well, they're beaten. And they just had this soft centre that wasn't very good. And we talk about that Bournemouth game. They should have won that game, actually. I remember Pukki had a good chance in the second half, which Ramsdale, I think, was in goal.
Yep,
and he made a very, very good save. But that kind of reaction, that kind of response to Norwich, where they sort of focus on the defensive solidity, we've not seen that enough this season. If they'd have perhaps ground out a few more points on the road, they could have perhaps retained their confidence for a little bit longer. But that period, again, I kind of mentioned, was sort of all in that blow of those away games for me, where they were it was kind of like you're watching the same game every week, where Norwich would be in the game for a little while. The opponents would have a spell, they'd find themselves 1 or 2-0 down, and that would be the game. And that's what it boils down to for me. You can kind of use the injuries as an excuse, if you like. And look, they're certainly there for all to see. They certainly had an impact, but for me, it was a lack of quality and a lack of strength in depth, and that really was the reason that Norwich City didn't win those football matches. Not because they didn't have Onel Hernandez fit, for example.
I think for me, the Watford loss sums up why Norwich City went down, which is a brave thing to say, but you look at the game and the fact that Watford was struggling. And when you're a team like Norwich in Norwich's position, they're the games you have to win. Because this is, it's not just any Watford team spending millions. It's a Watford team who are struggling in the Premier League. And they're the games they hadn't won. And you label that game as a game that you have to win to stay in the Premier League, and Norwich haven't. Now, following that was another international break, which I'd completely forgotten. And I remember we did a sort of mid-season review, or whatever you want to call it, with me, you and Joe, Connor. And we spoke about Emi Buendia. Now, Dave, I'm interested to know your thoughts on this in terms of this Buendia debate, because he was dropped after that game because he gave the ball away. What was it, twice? He'd given the ball away against Aston Villa. Do you think that was good man management from Daniel Farke? Because I often say it was.
Yeah, I was totally in Daniel's camp on that one. And as much as I absolutely love Emi Buendia, and I remember writing a column at the end of last season using the analogy that it was like having a player on loan from Barcelona in the Championship, that his creative ability was just unreal at that level. But the other side of Emi, as Daniel has always sort of said, it's, that South American fire. You can't take it out of him. You couldn't take that out of Diego Maradona, for instance, could you? He wouldn't have been the same type of player. And you just you're not seemingly able to coach it out of Emi, because I find it incredibly frustrating when you see him stropping around, throwing his arms up in the air, down on his knees, having a moan, shooting straight down the tunnel at full time when things are going badly. I just think it's childish behaviour, but unfortunately nothing has changed, has it? And it could be what holds him back in his career, that the bigger clubs may well be already looking at that ability, and just stats wise, the amount of creation for a team who have had a terrible season is incredible. But they may look at that personality side of stuff and think that guy needs to grow up. He's not there yet. He's not fully developed. And I don't think you've seen the maturity. But I think Daniel needs Daniel needs to take some of the blame as well, because, okay, he dropped him after that one, but just look where Buendia is at the start of that Watford game. He's popped up on the left within, 90 seconds. What's he even doing there? He's the right winger. You're a team who've just been promoted, who know, or you've got 38 free hits, who nobody's really expecting you to stay up. It would be a miracle, as Farke said, to stay up. Yet your right winger is popping up on the left and trying to backheel the ball in his own half inside 90 seconds with your 22-year-old centre-back charging up the left wing, getting robbed easily. And Watford are established in the Premier League. They'd been in the FA Cup final the season before. They signed Ismail Assar for 30 million. They were in a bad place, but compared to Norwich City, they were far more established in the Premier League. Gerard Deulofeu was a Barcelona player, has played for Everton, and he took advantage of it. He goes through. Tom Tribal even added into the mix by just not making a tackle. Just that's where you take the tactical foul, isn't it? Just take him out on the edge of the box rather than let him keep running. I think that was the night that quite a lot of Norwich fans thought, okay, here we go. This is going to be another relegation season. That to fold so spectacularly within 90 seconds on a big Friday night in front of the TV cameras, under the floodlights, everyone pumped for what would have been a massive win. To flop like that was where a massive bit of damage was done, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I remember in that video, that podcast we made, me, you, and Joe, Connor, it was very much like Buendia was just trying to do too much, which is his flaw, essentially. Although you can argue it's because he felt responsibility, whatever. That's a different chat for a different time, isn't it? And I remember, I think it was, I don't know when it was actually, I think it was May of 2019 or something like that. Kieran Scott came on this channel and you spoke to him and he said one of the risks with signing Buendia was we knew about this sort of temper. And we've seen it. We saw it against Burnley recently, didn't we? With that stupid bloody elbow in the back of the head or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I think that. What was I completely lost what I was going to say there. Right, we'll move on to something happier, which is Everton. I would like to go further, but we won't because that's then December, and that's a different video because December needs an entire video to itself. But what was the feeling? Because it was after an international break, and there's this idea that post-international break, you can sort of kick on. The minds are fresh, the legs are fresh. I don't think Norwich had too many players who were around international duty. I think Timu Pukki was, as you mentioned earlier, maybe for Finland or whatever. But after that win, Connor, was there a sense of optimism?
After the Everton win, sorry.
Everton, yeah. It was the 2-0 win, yeah.
Yeah, I think there was, because they'd done it a little bit differently. The way they used Kenny McLean offered a viable alternative to Marco Steepman, who at this point hadn't really sort of announced his arrival in the Premier League stage, I guess, hadn't made the step up. And they used McLean as almost like a target man, sort of number 10. And I think all the stats about his sort of aerial stuff came out afterwards, and he was so dominant in that game and helped Norwich get up the pitch, essentially. And it was just a different way of doing it. But equally, they retained their high fullbacks. They played really well that day, and there was an element of sort of digging in a little bit, and I think that's probably why there was optimism. It kind of felt like, right, they had to use this as the reset button now and use this formula and take it forward, because I've spoken and I've probably been overly critical at times this season of Norwich City and their balance, I think, overall, and the way that sort of their team is balanced. That for me was one of the most balanced I've seen them play, essentially. And Christoph Zimmermann was back, and I think his influence helped a lot. I think it was also a poor Everton side, I'll say that, who were in a real rut under Marco Silva. I remember after that game sitting in the press box and there being a Scouse man directing his fury at Bill Kenwright, who owns the football club, about Marco Silva. He's got to go, Bill. It was along the lines of it.
That was brilliant. Hold on.
He's got to go. He's the worst manager we've ever had.
Now you've gone up to Manchester. What's going on with the accents?
Yeah, it went a bit Oasis-y at the end, didn't it? But yeah, it was a good day. It kind of felt like they'd started again to some extent, and it's a shame that they didn't capitalise on that, because there are a lot of good elements of that performance. It was obviously their only away win this season as well, so it stands out for that. And they scored 2 goals. They only scored, what was it, 7 away?
2 of the 7, yeah.
Yeah, that goes to show, really. It turns out that was probably a bit of an off day for Everton rather than a very good Norwich City day. I mean, they only scored the 2nd goal late on, so it was probably far from comfortable. But I'd say they probably deserved to win that game. It's just a shame they didn't take the formula and the positivity forward.
Dave, do you think that I keep saying one of the reasons we went down, because there seems to be many reasons that we went down, but would you say that Norwich City's inability to replicate a performance like that is one of the reasons we went down? Because as Connor said, there was balance in it, and we've not seen that this season, other than maybe Everton. But would you say that is probably the case?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Zimmerman did make a huge difference that day. Byron played at left back, didn't he? He came in for Lewis, and he pretty much kept Jamal out until end of January, early February, something like that. And Lewis had actually pretty much fallen out of contention of the team. And I think Byron and Zimmerman coming back, that all of a sudden it was like, well, hang on, we've got a bit more defensive resilience here. So yeah, Everton were in a bad place, but the goal that Todd scored was just typical of him this season, wasn't it? So clinical with the chance that he took up against, England's number one. He was so good when he got his chances in front of goal this year. But I think Teddy was in midfield as well, wasn't he, for that one? Let me just double check.
I think he was.
Yeah, Teddy and Tribal played in that game, so that sort of you got that bit more defensive nous, along with McLean being further up the pitch, and that's before Pukki did his injury, wasn't it? So yeah, clearly if they could have produced more results like that, then it would have been a totally different season. But to have set the Premier League record for the fewest away goals scored in a season, to have managed to have scored less than that Derby team did of 2008, who got considerably less points than Norwich got. They got 12 points, isn't it?
11, I think.
I think it was 11. Yeah.
So 10 points fewer than Norwich even got in this disastrous season. Yet Norwich have scored fewer away goals than that team. I mean, it just seems bizarre, doesn't it? But then you can stick Dennis Rabini scoring on top of that pile as well, can't you? That was a really good day, and they were absolutely buzzing after that one. They really thought that to come back after an international break, which had been a little bit of a trend during Farke's time in charge, hadn't it, that after international breaks they did well, and they'd had that 2 weeks. They got Zimmerman back in. Hanley wasn't far away from returning. I think they sniffed a little bit of a revival, and to sort of tee up your next part of the podcast, they definitely had their opportunities to do that in December.
Oh, absolutely right, guys. I'm going to stick you on the spot. I'm quite looking forward to this. If you could sum up this period of Norwich City season in one word, Connor, you go first. What word are you using?
One word.
I'm not picking a word. I'll let the professionals do this.
Deflating, I think I'll go with.
You sticking with it? Deflating.
Well, is it not a good one?
I'm slightly underwhelmed, but that's your standard.
I'll explain my thought process. Deflating because obviously they had all the elation after beating Manchester City. And they didn't follow it up. So for me, it was kind of deflating, and we were kind of watching a team get their confidence beaten out of them every week, and gradually, and it was quite a tough watch, I think, during that period. As much as, again, not to touch on the territory of your next podcast, as much as December was difficult, I think they showed a lot more of themselves during that period than they did in this one. This one, it just kind of felt like teams had them at arm's length. So that's why I would go with deflating. If you're happy with that.
That's good. It was all right justification. Dave, what word are you going for?
Yeah, I think that is probably better than anything I'm going to come up with, to be perfectly honest. But let's just go for terrible. I mean, 6 defeats between the Man City and Everton wins. They managed 2 goals. They were both consolations from Dermot and Hernandez in heavy home defeats. With all the context that we've already put on top of it with the injuries, it was... that spell was when you really saw that Norwich weren't able to grind out results. If it had been different with those defenders in there, maybe, but I still wouldn't be betting my mortgage on it that it would have been different. I think they would have had at least a better chance of grinding out a few more points in there. But yeah, it was pretty tough watch at times.
It certainly was. Right, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Connor, I'll give you the responsibility, not that you actually probably need to, but where can we find the Pinkin and you and Dave on socials, etc.?
Pinkin.com. That's the main place. Pinkin YouTube channel, we've got that. Pinkin podcast, Instagram account. We're everywhere really.
Just type Pinkin in.
Yeah, just type Pinkin, you'll find us. And that's the best place for all your Norwich City news, opinion, and analysis. There you go.
And don't forget, I did this exact same thing when I went on the scrimmage once. I did exactly what you did and said all about the web stuff. And Chris Gorham interrupted me and said, and the Eastern Daily Press as well.
Yeah,
I can, of course, still buy newspapers. They still exist, folks. EDP and Even News still out there every day. Still sell plenty of copies. Still enough to keep us in business. So if you ever want the hard copy, then it's still out there.
Yeah, help keep us in a job.
Brilliant. Any personal social pluggage, or are we going purely professional?
No, we're all about the brand.
Do you know what? That is big respect. Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. If you could all like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, I'll be very grateful. In the next part, you'll see me talk to Stuart Hodge about December. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that, aren't we? And in following parts of the podcast, we'll be speaking to the Revere end on players who we want to sell and keep. And in the third part, I believe we've got John and Tom from Along Come Norwich to speak about Project Restart and the fun that will ensue from that. And until next time, we'll see you again very, very soon.